on to this. Don't let it go. That's the one thing that truth never changes, does it? So if we start out in the truth, guess what? You have to hold on to the truth all the way to the end. It does not ever change. The truth will always be the truth. And so that's where Solomon's at. And as he's issuing this call to attention to his son. And then he's going to get into kind of the gist of what this whole this whole proverb here is about. And so he says, "For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil." So I want to preface this because Solomon obviously is speaking to his son. And so he is obviously going to use the example of a female being the adulteress. In this case, he talks about the lips of an immoral woman and her mouth. And so he's going to refer to the female side of it a lot. But here's what I want us to understand is this works both ways. Okay? This works both ways. If he were talking to his daughter, he could issue the same warning that there are, you could change exactly what he's saying. He could say, "For the lips of a strange man," for the lips of a strange man drops as a honeycomb, and his mouth is smoother than oil. So I want us to understand that this is not just a one-sided situation, but rather this is both. But for the circumstance of speaking and addressing his son, he is using that of a woman. And so he says, "For the lips of an immoral woman drip honey." This explains again why it's important for the son to hold on to the discretion and the knowledge, because those things are going to be tested. You're going to be tested, and in this case, by the enticements of an immoral woman. And one of the things about honey, and I get there's people that don't like honey, but honey is sweet and oil is pleasant. Two things there that he talks about, that this woman, that her mouth is smoother than oil. Her, she can say things that are as sweet as honey, and these represent the temptations of immorality. There's a lot of that when it comes to immorality. And so Solomon's phrasing is very poetic and powerful. The figures of the lips and the mouth refer to the words of an immoral woman, and that she may use in her enticements and her attracting and trying to seduce someone. And so, the first steps of immoral associations are almost always made by what is said and by what is communicated. That's how almost any type of immoral association happens. By things that are said or by what is communicated. And so, I don't want to say all, because I think that may be, I can't necessarily validate or prove that. But again, the majority of immoral relationships, they start out and people have conversations and then words begin to be exchanged, and that's where these types of things start. And so again, that's the first steps, and this speaks to the great need for men and women to guard their speech and their communication with folks of the opposite sex. You have to keep that guard up. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you're at, and you have to keep that guard up. And so he says of an immoral woman here, and he focuses again on this, and I want to say this, reiterate this, because it's not just because he thought men are always moral. Okay, that's not the point here, or that it's mainly immoral women that seduce and corrupt moral men. But Solomon is way too wise to believe that and to think that. But like I said earlier, in other circumstances, he might have warned against immoral man. The principles of seduction can apply freely to both men and women. So we move down. So he talks about how that the lips of a strange woman drops as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil. And then verse 4 through 7. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold on hell. Lest thou shouldest ponder the path of life. Her ways are movable, that thou canst not know them. Hear me now, therefore, O ye children, and depart not from the words of my mouth. So here, as you get into verse number 4, you see a little bit of a contrast, a little bit of a comparison here, because he started out and he said that her words basically are sweet as honey and as smooth as oil. But then you get to verse number 4 and he says, but her end is bitter as wormwood. So there's again, the beginning of it is very enticing. The beginning of it may be really good and attractive, but the end, he says, is bitter. The results of what it's going to bring is bitter. And again, the sweetness and the allure of the immoral woman becomes bitter, and her smooth, oil-like pleasantness becomes, as he says as well here, it becomes as sharp as a two-edged sword. And so, again, we see the change. He says her feet go down to earth, if you will, there. Whenever we look at this, he says her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on hell. That could be translated, her feet go down to death. The path of this immoral woman, it leads to destruction. Again, he's talked about things that lead to destruction, the ways of the wicked, the ways of the immoral. And so he says that the wise man will ponder. He says, lest thou shouldest ponder the path of her life. The wise man will ponder her path of life. And he goes on, he says her ways are unstable. The decision to entice someone into immorality is not a decision made by a stable person who desires the best for either self or the one they entice. You understand that whoever is doing the enticing, in this case, this immoral woman that Solomon is talking about, she does not have the best interest for either whoever it is she's trying to entice or herself. She's not trying to bring good things. She doesn't desire the best for either one. And those led into immorality often feel that they know the motives of their partner in sin. But Solomon clearly observed that you don't know them. You don't ever know what the other person's motives are. And so if the sexual immorality is desired out of perceived impulse of love, maturity, and stability, would say, hey, if I really loved this person, I wouldn't act against their interest and my own. I would reject the immorality because I do in fact love them and will express my love only in ways that would honor God and His people. If the sexual immorality is desired out of for pleasure or adventure, maturity and stability would say my desire for pleasure and adventure must not reign supreme in my life. And whatever good I may think would come of this, it's not good and it's not going to bring good. But we oftentimes don't do that. So then he issues the call again. He says, hear me now, my children. Again, when we sense the serious nature of Solomon's appeal, and again, perhaps he understood how adultery brought disaster to David. You have to understand that Solomon was very privy to how that particular situation would impact his father. He saw firsthand, and so he issues this children. He says, listen, it starts out good. It sounds really good. It's very enticing. It seems sweet. It seems innocent. It seems real good. But you don't know her motives. You don't know what the other person's really thinking. And in reality, again, if there's any immorality in it, you can guarantee their motive is not for your gain or for your benefit. If it's to entice you to do anything that's immoral and against God, it's not going to benefit you or them. And so they don't have your best interest at heart. And how often do we see that? how often do we see that in situations of adultery, where people, they get into an immoral relationship, they get involved in adultery, and they think that they're, somehow they got this idea that they're in love. Most of the time those situations don't end well either. They end in destruction as well. And we'll see, he's going to talk about some of the problems that are going to come along with that immoral relationship. But you have to understand that, again, how often do we see that whenever things come to a head, that the two that were involved in the immoral relationship, regardless, they're both wrong. Doesn't matter who did the enticing. When one gives in, they're both in the wrong at that point. But what what we see is again, nothing good typically comes from it. There's all kinds of problems that come along with it. And so he says, listen, her ways are unstable. You don't know them. Please, please, please listen, pay attention to this. And then you get into verses 8 through 14. He says, remove thy way far from her. Come not nigh the door of her house, lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last, when thy flesh and thy body are consumed, and say, how have I hated instruction, and my heart despised reproof, and have not obeyed the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to them that instructed me. I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation and assembly. So he starts out there in verse number 8. He says, remove your way far from her. Solomon did not advise his son to stay in the immoral woman's presence and just see if you can resist it, son. Just stay there and see, you're strong. Be strong. You can do this, right? No. What does he say to do? He says, get out of there. I always go back to Joseph, whenever he's there and he's in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife comes and tries to seduce him. And listen, Joseph didn't even take time to get his clothes all the way back on. Joseph said, I got to go. He said, I got to get out of here. This woman's lost her mind. She's unstable, as Solomon says here. He says, I got to go. And now he still ended up in trouble. But, it wasn't a try to stay and calm the situation down. It was, you got to go, son. You got to get out of here. And that's what Solomon is telling his son here is, don't try to hang around. Don't try to be strong. Get out of there. Don't test your ability to resist her seductions. The best defense was distance. Don't even go near the door of her house. The Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse number 22 would kind of write something similar whenever he would talk about fleeing your youthful lust. The longer that we stay in the presence of such enticement of evil, the easier, or really I don't want to say, the easier it is to give in, but the worse the danger comes. The worse of the danger becomes, because the longer you linger there, the harder it is to fight. But if you get away from it, if you get out of it and you go on and you move on, get away, he says, don't even go near the door of our house. We must remove our way far from her. Is what he says going on. He says, remove thy way, verse number 8, far from her. Not only in presence, but in heart and in mind. We have to put away those things that and the enticements common in our day, and work for a mind set on things above. One of the saddest things whenever I look around, the promiscuity in our culture today is rampant. It's awful. And the lack of understanding of what God had given that was supposed to be meant for marriage is just thrown out the door. It is for whoever, wherever, whenever, however, whatever. It doesn't matter. There's no rules on it. There's no nothing. Again, it goes back to that if it feels good, do it mentality. And that's, again, that kind of goes along with the dangers of which Solomon is addressing here, but I love that, again, going back to verse 8, remove thy way far from her. I think it's not just that way with this situation, with this immoral woman that Solomon is addressing, but it's that way with sin in general. You have to get yourself away from it. And if there's somebody out there that is enticing you or drawing you to do things you have no business doing, guess what you need to do? You got to get away from them too. And so it's very important. And you go on, verse number 9, he says, lest thou give thine honor unto others. Solomon will describe many things that are lost through this sexual immorality, and he begins here with honor. Honor. I want you to think about that for just a moment. He says, lest thou give thine honor. That's one of the things that you lose in this type of situation. And, there is a valid sense of honor that the one who stays pure, the one who stays true can have. Whether that be prior to marriage or in marriage. I think both valid, both significant. And so there's a sense of honor that should go along with that. But when you give in, what he's saying here, he says, listen, you need to remove yourself from her. You need to don't go into the door of her house. You need to run and get away. Otherwise, what's going to happen? You're going to lose that honor. You're not going to. It's going to be taken from you. That honor that you would have by staying pure. And people who get involved in these type of immoral sins think that their problems are solved. One of the dangers, and again, it goes back to that communication. There's a lot of times people think, well, they understand me better than my spouse does. They relate, they listen, they whatever. And so they think that, hey, my problems are solved and, that life's going to get better. But I'm just going to tell you that disobedience to God's law always brings sad consequences. And people will eventually pay dearly for those brief moments of pleasure. It may seem good and all at the end, but I promise you, if it's sin, doesn't matter how good it feels and how it appears at the moment, there's going to be problems that are going to come with that down the road. And so, again, he says, you're going to lose your honor. He says, you're going to give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel. This adultery and sexual immorality ruin lives. God commands that relationship remain only in the covenant of marriage. Was not given to take away from our life and enjoyment. I think that's a misconception with this, is that, I'm only with one person. I can't enjoy myself. I can't. Listen, that is absolutely not God's plan. It is much deeper than that. And in reality, it adds to it, because when you look at verse number 10, he says, lest strangers be filled with thy wealth. This strangers is, exactly that. Someone, foreign to us outside of that marriage relationship. And, in our society, let me just put it this way. We know and understand that in most cases that there's many men would know what it's like to lose financially because of being involved in adultery. It's for real. I mean, that's in our society, we know that. And, he says, and you mourn at last. The mourning here spoken of is of the most excessive kind. It means to, it was often the word that was used there is often applied to the growling of a lion. And so, it's however bad you can think that. And, then he says, let strangers be filled with thy house, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger, and thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed. This sexual immorality can lead to disease, can lead to breakdown of one's health, even if it's not a disease that comes from having the illicit relationship. First and foremost, I don't understand how in the world people do it. Maybe I'm just too dumb. I have enough stress with normal life, right? I can't imagine, I go back, there was a football coach that coached in a county over from us not too many years ago that originally came from Alabama. And I can't imagine, he lived a double life. And people had no idea. He was a football coach. He had his one family, and then he had started another family. And I don't understand. But I'm going to tell you this. I can imagine the stress of living that double life and trying to continue that is enough to take away somebody's health. It's not good. It's not, and so, it consumes your flesh. And then you get down, and he says, you're gonna mourn. He said, it's gonna consume your body. He said, and then you're going to say, how have I hated instruction and my heart despised proof? One of I don't know that I've ever spoke with anybody that was in an adulterous relationship or at some point or another that didn't say, you know what, I regret that decision. I've never heard anybody say they didn't regret it. And, that's one of the great prices of being involved in that. And, when we see how empty the promises of sin are and how great the price for those sins are, oftentimes it brings deep sorrow. It brings deep regret. And that's the logical response because you see what it's done. You see how it affects you. You see how it affects others. And so there's a lot of men and women that have fallen into this type of relationship and in this situation, and they look at themselves and they say, how in the world did I end up here? How did I end up here? How could I be? And this is what Solomon's talking about whenever he says, and you say, how have I hated instruction? How did I get myself into this? How did I end up where I am? And, how could I give up so much for what amounted to so little? I also I've read, and I tend to agree, there was one commentator that talked about this, and, he talks about the mourning, and he talks about, acknowledging and wondering how in the world I got here, and how did I despise the instruction and the reproof that was given to me. And I don't know that those are necessarily sincere words of repentance, but rather a natural reaction to when you realize, it's kind of like I don't know whenever the prodigal son, sorry, I had to think of that name for just a second. Whenever he came to himself and he realized, man, my father's servants at home have more than what I have. Here I am laying in the pig pen. Here I am, eating with the pigs, and I'm at rock bottom. How did I end up here? I don't necessarily know that is a point of repentance. Now, him getting up and going back home to the Father shows that he did. But just acknowledging, and asking yourself, how did I get here? How did I do this? But that's a natural reaction. What Solomon says is if you give into this, if you don't flee from her door, if you hang around and you allow her to continue to entice, if you allow her to continue to seduce, if you will, he says, this is where you're going to end up. And whenever it's all said and done and you come to and you're laying in the pig pen, you're going to look at yourself and you're going to say, how did I get here? Then he says, I haven't obeyed my teachers. I didn't incline my ear to them that instructed me. I basically, you're one of those people that you heard what I said, but you didn't listen, right? You didn't take it. You didn't apply it. You didn't do anything with it. You just heard it, let it go in one ear and out the other. But then he says, I was almost in all evil in the midst of the congregation, the assembly. I would say probably 100% of the time, starting out when people get into these types of relationships, that they don't ever think that it's going to be exposed or it'll be found out. Nobody will ever know. Nobody will know. It'll remain secret. But when it's exposed, he says, in the midst of the assembly, his foolishness, his betrayal, and lack of self-control, guess what? It's going to become public. People are going to find out. And, I look at it this way, and let me say this, that what if it does? You say, well, what if somebody never finds out? Well, I guess lucky you, lucky them. But let me remind you, and this is, I heard this as a teenager, and it's stuck with me. I don't mean I always acknowledged it. But it don't matter what I know or anybody else knows that you have done or do not do, because God sees it all. It doesn't matter. It may remain secret from the public, but the one that matters sees all, knows all, is aware of everything that you do, whether it be done in the light or whether it be done in the darkness, whether it be done in public or whether it be done in private. And so you have to understand that eventually it's going to come out, and even if it doesn't, the one that does know knows best. So now Solomon says, he says all this. He says, listen, you need to be aware of this type of person. One that's going to entice you with smooth talking. They're going to say things that are pleasing to your ears. They're going to, they're going to lay it on thick. They're going to try to seduce you, entice you, all that. He says, this is what you need to do. You need to run. You need to get far away from them, because if you don't, it's going to bring problems to your life. You're going to mourn, you're going to weep, you're going to know, how did I get here? All these things, and there's a good chance it's going to become public, and then you're going to be embarrassed. You're going to lose your honor, your wealth, your health could be affected. All that, it's going to have an impact. Then he's going to give some instructions on what you ought to do. And in fact, you find satisfaction at home, in other words. Because then he says in verse 15, we're going to read down through verse 19, drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. Let her be as the loving hind and pleasant roe. Let her breast satisfy thee at all times, and be thou ravished always with her love. Some interesting wording here that Solomon uses. Drink water from your own cistern. Don't be going and getting water from somebody else's cistern. Okay, you say, well, what does that mean? Well, Solomon reminds his son that God provided him a wife to meet those needs. And instead of neglecting what God had given him, he should renew his gratitude and focus upon what God has blessed him with. This word water that is, again, used in verse 15. It's also used in Song of Solomon in chapter 5 and verse number 1. And it stands for quenching one's own sexual thirst. Satisfying that drive is likened to taking in solid food in Proverbs chapter 30 and verse number 20, and water and food in Proverbs chapter number 9. And so, he says, be satisfied with your own wife. Let the wife see that she reverence her husband. Don't tempt him by inattention or unkindness to seek elsewhere. And again, that same thing goes back and forth. It can work both ways, for the man or the woman, for the husband or the wife. He says, drink water from your own cistern. And then he says, and running water from your own well. This provision for this, because naturally this desire, this need is there for everybody at some point. And it's to be the provision to meet that need is to be found in one place: the marriage bed between a husband and a wife. And so, which, by the way, is pure before Him, according to Hebrews 13:4. It's like a pure, fresh spring, that running water. Unfortunately, the reason that a lot of times the latter happens and people are enticed easily or they get involved in those types of relationship is because some claim, they get to a point where they're dissatisfied at home. And I'm going to just be very blunt and very honest with you. They're dissatisfied. Know and understand this, that as a child of God, you're saying you're dissatisfied with what God gave you. And that dissatisfaction is typically, I probably could go always there, but that dissatisfaction that people claim to have, can I be very blunt and very honest, is typically because everybody, in this case, the one that claims to be dissatisfied wants to put the blame on the other person. I'm here to tell you it's more of a reflection of them than it is their spouse. It's easy to point the finger. It's easy to blame somebody else. But what is that person doing? What are they doing to help the situation first and foremost? But it's typically more a reflection of them than their spouse. And again, in our modern and very promiscuous, I don't know if that's the right word to use, culture. I'm trying to use some words to not just blow this whole thing up. But our culture promotes the idea that this type of satisfaction is mainly a physical sensation. That's all they want it to be, a physical. I think that there's definitely enjoyments of that type of relationship, but a more mature mind, and even looking at it from a biblical perspective, would understand that the mature mind sees intimacy, the open, unhindered revelation, reception, and sharing of oneself with another is a great reward in that relationship. And when it's reserved for the biblical boundaries of marriage, over the years and over the decades, here's what it says. It says, I'm here for you, and you're here for me. I'm my beloved, and he is mine. I know you more than anyone else, and you know me more than anyone else, and yet I love you and you love me. You know me more than anyone else. Our children, home life are protected and safe. We're not slaves to these sexual desires. We live by principles greater than these impulses, and we'll remain together and support each other as we grow old. And so he says, listen, you need to get well. You need to get water from your own well. Drink water from your own cistern. And then he says, should your fountains be dispersed? He says, let thy fountains be dispersed abroad and rivers of waters in the streets. Here the image changes, and the idea is that Solomon's son should regard this activity to be like a supply of giving water that should be set in the right channel. It's for the satisfaction of his wife. It's not for strangers. It's not for anybody else. It's for the satisfaction of his wife. And so, you have to channel that to the right place. You can't just have it just going everywhere. It's wide open. You ain't sending water everywhere, right? You send that water to the one that God gave you and the one that you're responsible to. Again, let them only be your own. It says, let thy fountain be blessed. Rejoice with the wife of thy youth. And, it's interesting. If you're like me, sometimes you struggle when somebody who has, if you ever receive advice from somebody that the advice they're giving you, they didn't follow it at some point or another. Anybody ever struggle with that? You're like, how can you give me advice on that whenever you didn't do that yourself? Well, Solomon alluded to God's plan for marriage. Even though he himself did not follow it. And, God's best for humanity is for a man to marry a wife and for him to rejoice with her for the rest of his days. And, this is, there is an element of choice. It's your wife, the wife of thy youth, and which indicates that there is an element of choice involved. And, you also have to, that choosing, when he says, let thy fountain be blessed and rejoice. So again, that's something that you have to choose to do. And there are times when a husband or a wife needs to choose to rejoice in their spouse. They need to choose. Our affections are so much more affected by where we choose to focus them rather than people realize. And so, I'm going to move down to verse number 20. And why wilt thou, my son, be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger? For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his goings. His own iniquities shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sins. He shall die without instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. Here, Solomon has just described how God has provided, for a husband's needs in marriage, and that being the case, it makes no sense for a man to fall into the trap of the immoral woman. He should not fall into her trap and her embrace. And he says, for the ways of men are before the eyes of the Lord. And again, just an important reminder for any man dealing with the temptation of an immoral woman. It's human nature to think that such sin, again, would never be or that such sin may be excused if it's never made public. If it's never made public, nobody's going to know. We think that if sin is, if it's never found out, if it's undiscovered, then maybe it'll be okay. People like to think that there's a lot of times they look at situations, they weigh it out, and they think, there ain't no risk involved in that. It's going to be all right. That's kind of risk-free. And, listen, that tends to tempt people more whenever they think they can get away with things. These folks that come up with all these, what in the world do you think has gotten there to be so many scam calls that we get? Why do you think people do those things? Because to them it's almost risk-free. If you hang up on them, that's fine. Somebody else over here is going to answer, and they're going to not be knowledgeable enough, and they're not, or just, maybe at a point where they're gullible enough, and they're going to give in, and so they'll get money over here, and hey, there's a good chance they'll never find out where that money went. And so it's risk-free to them. People like to think that whenever it comes to sin in general, is that if I can get away with it, then maybe it'll be excused. And Solomon rightly reminds us that, guess what? Again, just like I mentioned earlier, God sees all our ways. He knows everything. He before Him, there is no sin hidden. He knows it all. God ponders all His paths. Again, for the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and He pondereth all His goings. This goings is, the habits of man. The habits of man, the paths of man, the tracks made by constant use. Listen, God sees them. He knows them. He's aware of them. He says, his own iniquity shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with the cords of his sin. He shall be caught in the cords of his sin. This sexual sin, or especially in the violation of the marriage covenant, is a sin that entraps. It's a sin that it destroys. It brings destruction. It does not bring life. It's God's care and compassion that gives us His instruction for our conduct in this situation and its expression. That cords of a sin. A lot of people follow unlawful pleasures. They think they can give them up whenever they please. I'm here to tell you, when it comes to sin, don't underestimate it ever. No matter how great it may seem or how small it may seem. Don't underestimate the power that it can have to control you, to keep you, to cost you things that you never thought it would cost you. That's what these are. And again, sin repeated becomes customary, becomes habit, becomes something that we're okay with. And habit in the end assumes the form of necessity. Got to have it. Again, we see that in so many things. That's what addiction is it not? It becomes, you do it once, and then, just a few more times, and then it becomes customary, and then you keep doing it, and it becomes habit, and then you keep doing it more, and it becomes a necessity. You got to have it. You can't live without it. That's exactly what sin does. That's what the cord of his sin, and we become bound by that. Let me remind you tonight that if you're a child of God, you've been set free from that. Don't go back to it. Don't allow it to get back in and let it control you. And so when you do, you're going to be led captive by the devil and his will. And we have to understand that, again, that this brings destruction. And again, this sin of sexual immorality is no different than any other sin. Is there pleasure there? Sure. Is there attraction there? Sure. But the end result is deadly. The end result is devastation. The end result is destruction. The end result is again, the losing of the things that you can't get back. You know, that's one thing that, and I don't believe that we as Christians ought to hold things over people's head. If they get right and they repent of their sin and wrongdoing, then we're to forgive them, and even then we're supposed to forgive them. It's God's the judge. But what we have to understand is no matter how we like it, no matter how folks that tend to get caught in those things, people are always going to remember them by that. I think back, and you know, and I'm guilty of it myself, that you know, I think of pastors who have gotten involved in those types of situations, and it always makes me so sick to my stomach, and I'm thinking, man, just one more black eye. That's exactly what pastors need, just one more black eye, as if we don't already get enough. And then there's this, and then there's that pastor, and yet, you know, unfortunately, anytime you talk about that pastor or, you know, that was involved in that type of situation, guess what people always go back to? Oh, you mean the one that, yeah. The one that ran around on their wife? Yeah. That's, people are always going to hold that. You lose that honor, and it's not something that's easy to get back. And so Solomon is warning his son here of this. And like I said tonight, that this goes both ways. It can go for men and women. It can be an immoral man. It can be an immoral woman. And both are guilty out there in the world. Satan, he'll use either one, whichever one will let him use them, to entice people, to lure them astray, to get them caught up in this sin of sexual immorality. Because he knows the dangers of it. He knows the destruction of it. He knows, I say it all the time, that, and you have every right to disagree with me if you want to, but number one, public enemy number one of Satan is the home. Because if he can destroy the home, who makes up the church? Families. And if he can destroy homes, then he can destroy churches. And so we have to understand, it shouldn't surprise us that this is something that has become such a major issue in our society today. Because Satan knows, hey, we see it just, there were several years ago, and I don't know that I've eaten it one since, maybe I have. But there were some commercials that came out probably maybe even 10 years ago now, I don't remember. But Hardee's, using women half dressed to sell hamburgers. Really? You want to know why they do that? Because it sells. Because that's what people are, they chase after that. They're drawn to those types of things. And it's sad. And that's why Solomon told his son here, he said, listen, don't even stand at the door. Don't give it a place. Don't give it any attention. Get out of there. Run. Amen. Anybody have any thoughts, comments, or questions tonight?